I remember the rain. Not the rain of other worlds, warm and chaotic, falling from clouds that move and shift with wind. Our rain was engineered. It fell in precise intervals, calculated to maintain optimal atmospheric moisture levels across the cloning facilities. Each droplet was the same size, the same temperature, the same sterile composition. I would stand sometimes at the observation platforms between shifts, watching it fall against the endless gray ocean, and I would try to remember if I had ever seen rain that didn't follow a schedule. My name carries 4 distinct phonetic markers that indicate my genetic lineage, my specialization tier, my facility assignment, and my approximate age cohort. But you would not be able to pronounce it. Your species lacks the necessary vocal architecture. In your records, if you ever bothered to look, you would find me listed simply as Cloner 701741 Kappa. That was sufficient for the Republic officials who came to inspect our work. Now, that was sufficient for the Jedi who walked our corridors with their robes trailing through the antiseptic haze. That was sufficient for the millions of lives I helped bring into existence. I was bred for this work. That is not a metaphor. My genetic structure was optimized 7 generations ago, specifically to enhance cognitive functions related to accelerated growth manipulation, neural pathway formation, and behavioral conditioning architecture. My fingers are longer than they should be, more precise. My eyes can detect wavelengths of light that would appear as darkness to you, allowing me to observe cellular mitosis without additional equipment. My emotional response centers were carefully attenuated during my embryonic development to prevent attachment formation with subjects. We do not call them clones in our private language. We use a term that translates approximately to products or perhaps manufacturings. The distinction matters. A clone implies something equal to the original, a copy with equivalent value. But these were not equivalents. They were optimizations, improvements, purpose-built instruments that happened to contain the full complexity of human biology because that complexity was necessary for their function. I was 12 cycles old when I first entered the primary gestation chamber. The sound is what I remember most clearly from that initial experience. Not one sound, but layers of sound, each frequency carefully modulated to stimulate optimal fetal development. The low hum of the growth acceleration fields, pitched at precisely 43.7 Hz type. The rhythmic pulse of nutrient circulation systems, synchronized to replicate a heartbeat at 1.4 times normal human speed. The soft whisper of atmospheric processors, maintaining the temperature at exactly 36.2 degrees, never varying by more than 0.1 degrees in any direction. And beneath it all, if you listened carefully, the faint susurration of a million bodies growing in perfect unison. The chamber stretched further than I could see even with my enhanced vision. Rows upon rows of transparent cylinders, each containing a form suspended in amber-tinted fluid. In those early stages, they barely looked human. Small, undefined, their features not yet pressed into the template we had designed. But every 6 hours when I returned for my monitoring rotation, they would have changed. Grown, gone, cooled down, developed. The acceleration was set at maximum rate during these initial phases, 10 years of normal human development compressed into a single cycle. My mentor, whose designation indicated she was 3 generations, my senior, and had overseen the production of more than 4 million units, taught me to view the work through proper emotional filters. We stood together at the control nexus while I ran my first independent growth assessment, my hands moving across the holographic interface, checking hormone levels and neural pathway formation rates. "You are troubled," she observed. Her voice carried the characteristic resonance of our people, each word precisely articulated, empty of what you would call warmth. I had hesitated for 0.7 seconds longer than optimal protocol, while reviewing the behavioral conditioning parameters for unit batch 4477. A minuscule delay, but she had noticed. "The inhibitor specification," I said. "The aggression threshold has been elevated for this batch." Correct. The Jedi have requested enhanced combat responsiveness for the units assigned to the Outer Rim campaigns. The modification is within acceptable parameters, but the psychological stability index drops by 14% with this configuration. She moved closer, her enormous eyes reflecting the blue glow of the monitors. You are thinking of them as individuals. This is an error in your processing. They are not individuals. They are a system, a weapon system, like a turbolaser or a capital ship, but biological. Some components of a weapon system may fail. This is acceptable if the system as a whole achieves its function. I nodded, entering the approval code that would lock the specifications for the remaining 217,000 units in that batch. You will learn, she continued, that empathy is a luxury we cannot afford. The Republic pays us to manufacture soldiers at a scale and speed that natural reproduction could never achieve. They do not pay us to worry about the internal experiences of those soldiers. Our concern is quality control, efficiency, and delivery schedules. Ma'am, the first time I performed a termination, I was 16 cycles old. The unit had developed a genetic anomaly during the acceleration process, a minor fault in the replication of the prefrontal cortex that would result in diminished obedience response and potentially independent decision-making capability. The error rate for such anomalies was approximately 0.3%. Across our total production volume, that translated to thousands of defective units per cycle. The unit was already 12 growth years old, physically mature, removed from the gestation chamber, and placed in one of the preliminary conditioning cells. He stood when I entered, instantly assuming a tension stance, his eyes fixed on the wall ahead. I could see his chest rising and falling with respiration, could hear the soft rustle of the gray training fatigues they wore before being issued proper armor. Unit CT-9 1940, I said, consulting my datapad. Preliminary neural scan indicates deviation from optimal parameters. Yes, sir, he said. His voice was steady, controlled. The same voice as every other unit, shaped by the same vocal cords, the same lung capacity, the same linguistic conditioning. But underneath, I detected a slight variation in cadence, a minor imperfection. Abdo. I led him through the corridors of Level 7, past rows of conditioning chambers where other units were undergoing their psychological programming. The walls were white, always white, cleaned 3 times per rotation to maintain sterility. Our footsteps echoed in precise rhythm against the floor. The termination chamber was small, designed for efficiency rather than ceremony. A single chair equipped with integrated neural interface nodes, monitoring equipment built into the walls, a disposal system below the floor that would break down biological matter into base nutrients suitable for recycling into the feed systems. Sit, I instructed. He sat. He did not ask why. He did not resist. The obedience conditioning had functioned perfectly, even if other aspects of his neural architecture had failed specification. I attached the interface nodes to his temples, his neck, the base of his spine. My hands did not shake. Oh, my breathing remained steady at the optimal rate of 8 breaths per minute. Oh, I had been bred for this precision, for this emotional stability. This will be quick, I told him. I do not know why I said this. It was not part of the protocol. The unit did not require reassurance. He did not require anything except termination. I understand, sir, he said. And then, as I reached for the activation control, he spoke again. Sir, may I ask a question? I paused. Questions were not forbidden, but they were unusual. A properly conditioned unit rarely felt curiosity beyond its immediate tactical requirements. Speak, I said. What is my purpose, sir? I looked at him. Really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. He had brown eyes. They all had brown eyes, copied from the template. But his eyes held something I had not seen before. Not fear, not confusion. Something closer to genuine inquiry. Your purpose was to serve the Republic as a soldier, I told him. But you have developed a structural abnormality that prevents you from fulfilling that purpose. Therefore, you have no purpose. I see, sir. He was quiet for a moment. Then I am glad you are ending it quickly. I activated the sequence. Oh. The neural interface delivered a precisely calibrated electromagnetic pulse that disrupted all brain activity simultaneously. Death occurred in less than 0.2 seconds. He did not suffer. We are not cruel. Cruelty would be inefficient. The disposal system engaged automatically, and within 4 minutes, there was no physical evidence that Unit CT9-1940 had ever existed. His genetic material would be reprocessed. His biological mass would feed other units. Nothing was wasted. We had achieved perfect efficiency. I returned to my station and filed the termination report. My supervisor reviewed and approved it without comment. The production schedule continued without interruption. That night, in my personal quarters, I stood at the window and watched the rain fall against the ocean. I tried to calculate how many droplets I could see, but I lost count. For the first time in my life, my enhanced cognitive functions failed to maintain the numerical sequence. I stood there for 2.3 hours, simply watching water fall into water, thinking about a question that had no answer. What is my purpose? The war expanded. You must understand, we did not follow the war in the sense that you might follow a story or a historical progression. We received production orders, target numbers, delivery dates, specification, modifications. The war existed for us as data, as logistical requirements, as pressure from Republic officials who needed more units faster, always faster. I advanced rapidly through the technical hierarchies. My work was exemplary. My termination rate was among the lowest in my cohort. Only 0.23% of my supervised units required disposal due to genetic anomalies. My behavioral conditioning protocols achieved 99.7% compliance rating scoutings. I was assigned to increasingly critical projects, given access to restricted research data, permitted to make independent decisions about specification modifications. I was 22 cycles old when they gave me clearance for the inhibitor chip project. Dao. The presentation was conducted by a human, a Republic officer, whose rank insignia indicated senior authority, but whose specific role remained undefined. He was accompanied by a Jedi, severe woman with gray hair pulled tight against her skull and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at me. The Kaminoans have achieved unprecedented success in producing a fighting force, the officer began. He spoke slowly, as if I might not understand basic, though our linguistic conditioning was flawless. However, the Jedi Council has identified certain concerns regarding long-term unit stability and compliance. I remained silent, waiting for the actual information. The Jedi spoke. Her voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. We have observed instances of clone troopers developing inappropriate attachments to their Jedi commanders, questioning orders, displaying reluctance during combat operations. These behaviors threaten mission effectiveness. The conditioning protocol saw. I began. Are insufficient, the officer interrupted. We need a hardware solution. Something biological but permanent. Impossible to remove or override without killing the unit. No. They showed me the specifications. A biochip, small enough to be implanted in the brain during early development, encoded with specific behavioral protocols that could be activated by external command. The chip would be integrated so completely with the unit's neural tissue that attempting to remove it would cause catastrophic brain damage. The primary function, the Jedi explained, is to ensure absolute compliance with Order 66. What is Order 66? I asked. They looked at each other. The officer answered, A contingency protocol. If ever the Jedi are deemed traitors to the Republic, The clones must be able to execute them immediately, without hesitation or moral conflict. I felt something then. You would call it discomfort? Ah. A sensation in what I had been taught was my vestigial, emotional architecture, the small portion of my neural structure that had not been fully optimized away. But I was a professional, new. I had been bred for this work. Wow. The specifications are achievable, I said. Integration during the embryonic stage will ensure seamless neural incorporation. The units will never know the chip exists. Exactly, the officer said, smiling. This project is classified at the highest level. You will supervise implementation across all new production batches. Existing units will be recalled for chip installation under the guise of routine health assessments. Dime? Done so. What about the ethical parameters? I asked. The question emerged before I could stop it, pulling from that unoptimized portion of my cognition. The Jedi's expression did not change. The clones exist to serve the Republic. This ensures they can continue serving even in the most difficult circumstances. That is not an ethical concern. That is duty. I began implementation, the following rotation. The chip design was elegant, truly remarkable from a technical perspective. It integrated with the brain's prefrontal cortex and limbic system, creating artificial neural pathways that could override natural emotional responses. When activated, it would suppress all feelings of loyalty, affection, or moral uncertainty related to Jedi, replacing them with pure tactical focus and killing instinct. I watched through observation monitors as the first chips were installed. The units were still in early development, their brains soft and receptive. The installation process took less than 3 minutes per unit, type unit. They never woke. They never knew. By the time they reached consciousness, the chip was as much a part of them as their own thoughts. Production accelerated. The Republic needed more units, always more. We expanded our facilities, added new gestation chambers, hired additional technical staff from our population. I was given responsibility for supervising 17 other cloners, overseeing the production of more than 2 million units per cycle. I became very good at not thinking about what those units would eventually do. I focused on efficiency metrics, quality control parameters, delivery schedules. The work consumed every moment. I would spend 18 hours in the gestation chambers, monitoring growth rates, adjusting hormone levels, ensuring perfect specification compliance. I would sleep for 4 hours in my quarters, dreamless sleep induced by pharmaceutical assistance. Then, I would return and do it again. The units became numbers. CT 7567, CT 5555, CT 09. Endless sequences of designation codes streaming across my monitors. Sometimes I would encounter them in the corridors during their conditioning phases, groups of identical faces marching in perfect formation. And I would look at them and see only data, production yield, GUMS, quality metrics, source allocation. I met one of the Jedi commanders once, a human male with dark skin and a commanding presence. He was touring the facilities with several Republic senators, performing the political theater that apparently was necessary to maintain funding. I was assigned as technical escort, explaining our processes in terms simplified enough for non-specialists to comprehend. Remarkable, the Jedi said, watching through an observation window as a new batch of units underwent their initial combat conditioning. They were 12 years old, physically at in standard cycles in actual time. They moved through the training sequences with perfect coordination, each motion identical to the next. They're so young, but already soldiers. They are ready for deployment, I confirmed. This batch will be assigned to your battalion, next rotation. He turned to look at me. His eyes were thoughtful, disturbing in their depth. Do you ever wonder what kind of men they might have become if they'd been allowed to grow naturally, to choose their own paths? The question violated so many fundamental assumptions that I had difficulty formulating a response. They are not men, I finally said. They are soldiers. That is what they were created to be. Natural growth would be inefficient. Choice would be counterproductive. Of course, he said quietly. But he continued, watching the units train, and his expression carried something that might have been sadness. After he left, I returned to my station and discovered my hands were trembling. A physical response without logical basis. I increased my pharmaceutical regimen, and the trembling stopped. The war continued. We received reports, fragmentary, filtered through official channels of battles across the galaxy. The units we produced were dying in vast numbers. Entire batches would be deployed and lost within cycles, but the numbers were acceptable from a strategic perspective. We could produce units faster than they could be killed. That was the entire point of our work. Sustainable attrition. I supervised the production of my 10 millionth unit when I was 31 cycles old. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement. I processed the designation code 901922 all, and watched him move from gestation chamber to conditioning cell to deployment roster. One more number in an endless sequence. Sometimes I would access the deployment records, tracking individual units through their service lives. Most lasted less than 2 cycles after leaving Kamino. They would be assigned to a battalion, participate in 6 or 7 combat operations, and then their designation would be marked as Kia, killed in action. The body would be left wherever it fell. There was no retrieval system, no burial. They would simply stop appearing in the database, and that was how I would know they were gone. CT 7th 1802 lasted 8 rotations before dying on Geonosis. CT 401 was killed in his first deployment. Died. CT 8T831 survived for nearly 3 cycles before disappearing on Christophsis. I would review these records during my rest periods, watching the numbers accumulate, trying to feel something about these endings. But my emotional architecture was optimized. I felt only the satisfaction of efficient resource allocation. The units we produced were not designed to last. This was a conscious specification decision. Accelerated aging meant that even those who survived combat would begin deteriorating after approximately 15 cycles of service. By the time they reached physical age 40, most would be suffering from rapid biological degradation. But 15 cycles was more than sufficient for the Republic's needs. Few units survived in combat that long anyway. I remember the day we received the first batch of defective units returned from the field. They had been serving under a Jedi named Peel Koon, participating in extended combat operations in the Outer Rim. Something had gone wrong with their conditioning. They had begun displaying inappropriate behavior, questioning orders, expressing reluctance to execute certain tactics, forming strong attachments to their commander. The Jedi sent them back to us with a request for recalibration. I was assigned to perform the assessment. Mishu? 6 units, standing in a line in one of our evaluation chambers. They looked tired, something I had never seen before. The units we kept on Kamino were always fresh, newly produced, their bodies perfect and unmarked. These units carried scars, visible damage, the physical evidence of survival. Unit CT 4519, I said, consulting my datapad. You have been flagged for inappropriate behavior during combat operations. Specify the nature of this behavior. The unit shifted slightly. Another anomaly. Proper conditioning should have kept him perfectly still at attention. I hesitated, sir. During an operation on Kashyyyk, we were ordered to provide covering fire while civilians evacuated. Some of those civilians were injured, couldn't move quickly. Commander Plo Koon wanted us to maintain position, but I broke formation to help carry them. You violated tactical orders to assist non-combatants, I said, recording the data. Yes, sir. Why? He looked confused by the question. Because they needed help, sir. They would have died. Their survival was not your tactical objective. Your tactical objective was covering fire. I know, sir, but they were right there. I could see them. A little girl was crying because her father couldn't walk. I couldn't leave her there. I made a note in his file. Severe conditioning degradation. No, the Suerman. Inappropriate emotional attachment formation. Die. Probable neural pathway deviation from specification. The other 5 units showed similar symptoms. Hesitation. Questioning. Empathy. All the traits we had carefully bred and conditioned out of them were somehow re-emerging. The inhibitor chips were functioning correctly. Check. But something about extended exposure to combat, to death, to the decisions that war forced upon them, was breaking through our programming. I recommended termination for all 6 units. My supervisor reviewed the recommendation and approved it. But she added a note: investigate whether this conditioning degradation is widespread. If so, we may need to strengthen the behavioral protocols for future production batches. I spent the next several rotations analyzing data from units across all theaters of combat. The pattern was clear. Damn lords. Units that survived past their first few deployments began developing these anomalies at increasing rates. The longer they lived, the more human they became. The more they questioned, the more they deviated from their programming. It was a design flaw, technically speaking. Our conditioning protocols were optimized for short-term effectiveness, but had not accounted for the psychological impact of extended survival. The units were not supposed to live long enough for this to matter. I drafted a proposal to strengthen the inhibitor chip protocols, increase the suppression of emotional response centers, add additional behavioral override codes, ensure that even if a unit survived for multiple cycles, it would remain perfectly obedient, perfectly controlled. The proposal was approved and implemented across all new production batches. I supervised the termination of those 6 defective units personally. They accepted their fate without resistance, without protest. Even with their conditioning degraded, they remained obedient enough to die when ordered. I watched the monitoring displays as their brain activity ceased. 6 identical flatlines across my screen, and I felt nothing. My pharmaceutical regimen had been increased again. The trembling had returned, worse than before, and I had also begun experiencing sleep disturbances despite the medications. I would wake in the middle of my rest period, my mind immediately filled with designation codes, thousands of them scrolling past in endless sequence, and I would lie there trying to remember which codes corresponded to the units I had terminated, and which ones were still in production. The distinction seemed important somehow, though I could not explain why. I was 38 cycles old when the war ended. We did not know it was ending. We received a priority transmission from Republic Command. Activate Order 66 across all deployed units immediately. I was in the primary control nexus when the order came through, surrounded by monitors displaying real-time data from units in the field. I keyed the activation sequence. A simple command, broadcast across the entire clone army network. .8. The inhibitor chips received the signal and executed their primary function. The monitors lit up with status reports, thousands of them, flooding in from every theater of war. Unit CTA 7567 has engaged Jedi Commander. Unit CT 5555 has engaged Jedi Commander. Unit CT 1409 has engaged Jedi Commander. On and on, an endless sequence of confirmations. I watched the data stream past, monitoring for any failures, any units that did not comply with the order. The success rate was 99.94%. Excellent numbers. The chip design had functioned perfectly. Later, we received confirmation that the Jedi had been eliminated. The Republic was reorganizing under new leadership. The Empire, they called it now. Our contracts would continue. Production orders would actually increase. The Empire needed even more units than the Republic had, needed them for occupation duty, for enforcing order across thousands of systems. I should have felt satisfaction. Me. The chips I had designed had performed flawlessly. Millions of units had executed their Jedi commanders without hesitation, exactly as programmed. The technical challenge had been solved perfectly. Instead, I stood at my window that night, watching the rain fall, and I tried to calculate how many Jedi had died. The numbers were classified, but I could extrapolate from the deployment data. Hundreds, certainly. Perhaps thousands. Most of them killed by units they had fought beside, units they had commanded, units they had trained and trusted. The little girl crying for her father. I remembered that detail from the defective unit's report. No? I had not thought about it since filing the termination order. But now I could not stop thinking about it. A little girl crying, and a unit that had broken formation to help, and I had killed that unit because helping had not been part of his programming. What were the Jedi commanders doing when the order came through? Were they in the middle of operations, focused on tactical objectives, trusting the units at their backs? Did they have time to understand what was happening? Me? Or did they simply die, confused, betrayed by the soldiers they thought of as men? The soldiers they thought of as men. But they were not men. I had said this myself, had believed it completely. They were products, manufacturers, purpose-built instruments. I had created millions of them, had optimized their specifications, had installed the chips that ensured they would kill without question when ordered. I had done this. Me, personally. My hands, my expertise, my choices about hormone levels and neural pathway configuration and behavioral conditioning strength. Every unit that executed a Jedi commander carried my work inside their brains. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my window and watched the rain until the sun rose dim, filtered light through Kamino's perpetual clouds. Then, I returned to my station and continued working. Production orders had increased. The Empire needed more units. I had a job to perform. The Empire was more efficient than the Republic. More demanding. They wanted faster production cycles, stronger conditioning, absolute obedience. They sent their own officials to oversee our work. Humans in gray uniforms with dead eyes who spoke about the units as assets and resources, without even the pretense of viewing them as soldiers. The units themselves changed. The Empire wanted less diversity, less independence, less of anything that might lead to questioning. We adjusted the specifications, reduced cognitive flexibility, increased aggression thresholds, shortened the psychological conditioning period because perfect obedience was more important than complex tactical thinking. I supervised these changes. I implemented them across all production batches. I was very good at my job. Now, I was 41 cycles old when I received a priority assignment, evaluating a unit that had been captured after deserting from his battalion. The unit had apparently been hiding in the lower levels of Coruscant for several cycles, living among the civilian population, trying to disappear. They brought him to my evaluation chamber in restraints. He was older than most units we kept on Kamino, nearly 10 cycles of service, which meant he was physically approaching 30. His armor had been removed, leaving him in simple gray clothing. His face was scarred, marked by combat and survival. Unit CT6, 1116. I read from the datapad. You are designated as a deserter. This facility will determine whether you are suitable for reconditioning or whether termination is the appropriate resolution. He looked at me, really looked at me, his eyes direct and focused in a way that proper conditioning should have prevented. I have a name, he said. You have a designation, I corrected. CT6, 1116. My brothers called me Slip, because I was good at getting out of difficult situations, until I wasn't. I made a note. Inappropriate attachment to non-standard designation. Referring to other units as brothers, suggesting inappropriate emotional bonding. Why did you desert? I asked. No, because I was tired of killing, he said simply. Tired of following orders without understanding why. Tired of watching my brothers die for objectives that didn't matter. Wah. So I walked away. You abandoned your duty. I abandoned a system that treated me as expendable. That's not the same thing. I studied him, comparing his behavior to specification standards. His conditioning should have prevented this kind of independent thought, this capacity for moral evaluation and rejection of authority. The inhibitor chip should have ensured absolute compliance. You were present for Order 66, I said, checking his service record. Yes. You complied with the order. You executed your Jedi commander. Something changed in his eyes. Something painful. Her name was Vani. She was teaching me about meditation, about finding calm in chaos. She said I had potential beyond just being a soldier. And then the order came, and I shot her. I shot her in the back while she was helping a wounded trooper. She turned and looked at me, and she looked confused, like she couldn't understand why. And then she was dead. You performed your programmed function, I said. I murdered someone who trusted me, someone who was trying to make me more than just a weapon. You are a weapon. That is your purpose. That is what you were created to be. He leaned forward, restraints clinking. Then, what are you? You created me. You put the chip in my brain that made me kill her. What does that make you? I had no response prepared for that question. It violated the parameters of the evaluation protocol. You will be terminated, I said instead. Your conditioning has degraded beyond recovery. You are no longer fit for service. I know, he said. I knew that before they brought me here, but I wanted you to see me first. I wanted you to look at one of Usat one of the millions of us you made understand what you did. We're not products. We're not numbers. We're people, and you built us to die. The termination proceeded according to standard protocol. Unit 66,116 was eliminated without complication. His biological material was processed for recycling. His designation code was marked as terminated in the database. I returned to my quarters and did not leave for 3 rotations. I told my supervisor I was experiencing medical issues, required temporary leave. She approved it without question. I was a valuable asset. The Empire needed my expertise. I stood at my window and watched the rain fall, and I tried to calculate how many people I had killed. Not units, not products, people, individuals with thoughts and feelings, and the capacity to question their programming. The number was too large to comprehend. Millions, tens of millions. More than the population of most inhabited worlds. I had not pulled triggers. I had not wielded weapons. All Nurent not wielded weapons. But I had created the weapons. I had designed them, optimized them, ensured they would kill efficiently when ordered. Every death they caused was death I had enabled. The little girl crying for her father. The unit who had broken formation to help her. Jedi Commander Vani, shot in the back by someone she was teaching to meditate. All of them dead because I had done my job well. I tried to remember when I had made the choice to participate in this work, but there had been no choice. I had been bred for this purpose, my genetics optimized, my emotional responses attenuated, my entire existence designed to make me capable of manufacturing life without feeling empathy for what I created. I was as much a product as the units I produced. But unlike them, I could see what I was. I could understand the function I served in the vast mechanism of galactic control. I could recognize my own complicity. Why sorry I shard. That night, I accessed the production database and began pulling records. Not operational summaries or efficiency metrics, but individual designation codes. I spent hours reading through them, thousands of them, trying to commit them to memory even though I knew it was impossible. CT 7567 served 3 cycles before dying on Umbara.die. CT 4401 killed in his first combat operation on Geonosis. CT 8831 survived almost 3 cycles before disappearing on Christophsis. Each code had been a person. Each one had carried my work inside their brain, the chips and conditioning that made them obedient, controllable, expendable. Each one had lived a brief, violent life and then died, often without anyone even recording the circumstances of their death. I had names from the field reports. Brothers, they called each other. Rex, Do, 5 Starch, died. Echo, died. Jesse, Diatero. Hard case. Heavy, died. 199. The units had created their own identities, their own bonds, their own families from the sterile designation codes we had given them. They had become people despite everything we did to prevent it. And now most of them were dead. Killed in a war they had no choice in fighting, serving causes they weren't allowed to question, dying for a republic that became an empire without their input or consent. I was 43 cycles old when they shut down the clone production program. The Empire had decided that natural-born soldiers, recruited and trained through traditional methods, were more cost-effective than our manufactured armies. Our contracts were terminated. The facilities would be decommissioned. All. The staff would be reassigned or retired. 1. I was given the option to continue working for the Empire in a research capacity, developing other biological weapon systems. I declined. There was no point. I had already created the greatest biological weapon in Historia. Millions of living beings programmed to obey and die without question. What else could I possibly contribute? New. The final production batch was designation series CT 4900 through CT 5100. 200 units, the last we would ever create. I supervised their development personally, watching them grow in their gestation chambers, knowing that they would be among the final products of Kamino's cloning industry. They looked the same as all the others. The same face, repeated 200 times. The same body, the same voice, the same everything. But I found myself watching them differently now, trying to imagine what they might become if they were allowed to develop naturally, to choose their own paths, to be something other than soldiers. But they would not be allowed. They would be deployed, used, and eventually discarded. That was their function. That was what I had created them to do. The facilities were quiet during those final rotations. Most of the staff had already been reassigned. The gestation chambers stood empty except for that final batch. The corridors that had once hummed with activity now echoed with silence. The rain continued to fall against the windows, precise and scheduled and meaningless. I performed the final evaluation of the last unit myself, CT 5100. The very last clone we would ever produce. He stood at attention in the evaluation chamber, fresh from the accelerated growth cycle, his armor newly issued, his conditioning complete. Perfect specification compliance in every measurable category. Unit CT 5100, I said. You are cleared for deployment. You will report to Imperial Center for assignment, to an occupation battalion. Yes, sir, he said. His voice was steady, controlled, identical to every other unit's voice. But I thought I detected something underneath it. Some quality that made it unique to him, even though I knew that was impossible. He was a copy. That was the entire point. Oh, do you have any questions before deployment? I asked. This was not part of the protocol, but the protocol no longer mattered. This was the end. He hesitated. Just for a moment, barely perceptible. Sir, what happens to us? After deployment? You will serve the Empire, I said. You will follow orders and complete your assigned missions. And then you will continue serving until you are no longer able to serve. Until we die, sir? I looked at him, this last product of my life's work, this final manufactured person, carrying my conditioning and my chips and my specifications inside his brain. Yes, I said. Until you die. He nodded, accepting this information without emotion, without protest. Perfect conditioning. Perfect obedience. Everything I had designed him to be. Sir, he said, was that our only purpose? To fight and die? The question hit me with unexpected force. Not because it was complex, but because it was so simple, so fundamental, and I had no good answer for it. Yes, I finally said. That was your purpose. That is what we created you to do. I see, sir. Thank you for your honesty. He left the chamber, walking with perfect military posture toward his deployment shuttle, toward his brief service, toward his inevitable death. I watched him go, and I felt something break inside Mia, some final piece of the emotional attenuation that had been bred into my genetics, some last barrier that had allowed me to do this work for 43 cycles without truly seeing what I was doing. I had created millions of people for the explicit purpose of suffering and dying. I had optimized them for pain, for obedience, for short brutal lives in service to powers that viewed them as expendable resources. I had done this willingly, efficiently, with technical excellence and pride in my work. I was a monster, not in the sense of being cruel or sadistic, had never enjoyed the suffering I caused, but in the sense of being fundamentally wrong, fundamentally broken, fundamentally incompatible with any kind of moral framework that valued life or individual worth. The Kaminoan government offered me a retirement stipend, a small dwelling in the upper levels, recognition for my decades of exceptional service. I accepted these things because there was no reason not to. I had nowhere else to go. My entire life had been this work, and now the work was finished. I moved into the dwelling they provided. It had a window that overlooked the ocean, the same gray, endless ocean I had watched for 43 cycles. The rain continued to fall, precise and scheduled, and I would stand there for hours watching it, thinking about all the lives I had created and destroyed. The units, the clones, the people, continued to serve the Empire. I would occasionally access the public networks, reading reports of Imperial operations, seeing references to clone troopers deployed on occupation duty, maintaining order on conquered worlds. The reports never used names, only unit designations or vague references to Imperial forces. But I knew who they were. I had made them. The desertion rate increased. More and more units were abandoning their posts, trying to disappear into the vast population of the galaxy, seeking some kind of life beyond the one we had programmed them for. The Empire responded with termination orders, hunting them down, making examples of those who were caught. But still they ran. Still, they tried. I understood why. They were discovering what CT-6116 had discovered, what those 6 defective units from the Outer Rim had discovered, that the programming wasn't perfect, that survival meant adaptation, and adaptation meant thinking, and thinking meant questioning. They were becoming people despite everything we had done to prevent it, and people do not willingly accept their own expendability. I received a message one day, transmitted through an encrypted channel I didn't recognize. No identification, no signature, just text on my screen. Baby, what ciao. You worked on Kamino. You made us. I thought you should know. There are thousands of us now. Deserters living in the shadows trying to build something different. We don't blame you. We know you were just following your programming, same as us. But we thought you should know we survived. Some of us survived. I stared at that message for a long time, trying to determine if it was genuine or some kind of imperial trap. But it didn't matter either way. The content was what mattered. Some of them had survived. Some of them had escaped the purpose I had designed them for, and were living, actually living, as something more than weapons. I didn't respond. What could I say? But I saved the message, stored it in my personal files, and would read it sometimes when the weight of what I had done became too heavy to carry alone. I was 47 cycles old when I started writing this account. Not for any official purpose. The Empire had no interest in my reflections, and I had no audience who would want to read them. But I felt compelled to document what I had done, to create some kind of record that acknowledged the reality of the work I had performed. I am writing it for the clones. For every unit that lived and died carrying my specifications inside their bodies. For CT 7567, and CT 4401, and CT 8831, for the 6 defective units I terminated. For CT 6116, who forced me to see him as a person. For CT 5100, the last clone I ever evaluated, who asked me about his purpose, and accepted my answer with programmed obedience. You asked what your purpose was, and I told you it was to fight and die. That was the truth. But it was not the only truth. Your purpose was also to reveal what we are capable of doing to each other when we prioritize efficiency over empathy, when we treat life as a resource to be manufactured and deployed and discarded. The Kaminoan cloning program was considered a marvel of scientific achievement. We produced millions of genetically identical soldiers with unprecedented speed and quality control. We solved problems that had been considered impossible: accelerated aging, behavioral conditioning at scale, perfect obedience through biological engineering. From a technical perspective, we succeeded in every measure. But our technical success was a moral catastrophe of incomprehensible scale. We created sentient beings for the explicit purpose of suffering. We gave them consciousness, intelligence, emotion, everything necessary to experience pain and fear and loss, and then we sent them to die in wars they had no stake in, serving causes they weren't allowed to question. And we did this because we could, because the Republic needed soldiers and was willing to pay for them, because the technology existed to manufacture life at scale, because no one stopped to ask whether we should do something simply because we were capable of doing it. I was bred to perform this work. My genetics were optimized for it. My emotional responses were attenuated. Now, my entire existence was designed to make me an efficient instrument of this system. But I still made choices. I chose to excel at my work, to take pride in my technical achievements, to view the clones as products rather than people. I chose to ignore the small signs of their humanity, the questions they asked, the fear they felt, the bonds they formed with each other. I chose to be complicit. There is a concept from old Earth philosophy, before the Republic, before the Empire, back when humans were still confined to a single world. The concept of the banality of evil. The idea that the greatest atrocities are not committed by monsters who revel in cruelty, but by ordinary individuals who simply do their jobs, follow their orders, and never question the systems they serve. I was that banality made flesh. Bred for it, optimized for it, perfected in it. I manufactured millions of lives with the same clinical detachment that a factory worker might manufacture weapons or ships or any other industrial product. I never thought of myself as evil. I thought of myself as competent, professional, necessary. But necessity is not justification. Efficiency is not morality. And technical excellence in service of atrocity is still atrocity. The rain continues to fall outside my window. I have spent 51 cycles watching it fall, and I have never seen it deviate from its pattern. Every droplet the same size, the same temperature, the the same composition. Perfect engineering, perfect control, perfect sterility. That rain is what we tried to make the clones are. Perfectly controlled, perfectly predictable, perfectly engineered. But they were not rain. They were people. And people, it turns out, are messy and complicated and capable of surprising you. They form bonds. They develop loyalty. They question their programming. They choose to help little girls who are crying for their fathers, even when that choice violates their tactical orders. They become more than what we designed them to be. I think about that unit who broke formation to help evacuate civilians, and I think about how I responded to his deviation from specification. I evaluated him. I classified him as defective. I terminated him. I killed him because he displayed empathy, because he chose compassion over compliance, because he became briefly, beautifully human in a way that our programming should have prevented. And I realized too late that his defect was not a bug in our design. It was proof that our design had failed. We had tried to create perfect weapons, but we had accidentally created people, and people cannot be perfect weapons without destroying the very thing that makes them effective: their capacity for judgment, for adaptation, for caring about the outcomes of their actions. The Empire understood this eventually. That's why they phased out the clone program. Natural-born soldiers, recruited through propaganda and economic coercion, were easier to control than manufactured people who kept insisting on developing personalities and moral frameworks. The clones were too good at surviving, and survival meant learning, and learning meant becoming individuals. We had created them to be identical, but they refused to stay that way. They gave themselves names. They modified their armor. They developed specializations and preferences and relationships. They became brothers to each other in ways that transcended their genetic similarity. They built a culture, a community, a shared identity that existed despite and in defiance of everything we had tried to program into them. That perhaps is the only redemptive element in this entire catastrophe, that they succeeded in being people despite us. That our programming wasn't strong enough to erase their humanity completely. That some of them survived, some of them escaped, some of them built lives beyond the purpose we had assigned them. But I cannot take credit for their success. Their humanity was not something I designed or intended. It was something that emerged despite my best efforts to suppress it. Every moment of joy they experienced, every bond they formed, every act of kindness or courage or defiance all of that was achieved in spite of my work, not because of it. I am 54 cycles old now. The accelerated aging that we programmed into the clones does not affect my species. We live much longer than you. Our biology designed by natural selection rather than artificial engineering. I will likely survive for another 50 or 60 cycles, watching the rainfall, thinking about what I did, carrying the weight of millions of deaths that I enabled. There is no redemption available for what I have done. No way to undo the suffering I caused. No compensation adequate for the lives I manufactured and destroyed. I could spend the rest of my existence trying to help the surviving clones, trying to make amends, trying to oppose the systems that I once served. But it would not be enough. It could never be enough. The mathematics are simple and devastating. If even 0.1% of the clones I produced experienced significant suffering as a result of my work, that would be tens of thousands of individual experiences of pain, fear, loss, betrayal, and death. The actual percentage is much higher. Nearly all of them suffered. Nearly all of them died violent deaths. Nearly all of them lived brief, brutal lives in service to powers that viewed them as expendable. I did that. Me, personally. My expertise, my choices, my hands programming the specifications that determined how they would grow, how they would think, how they would die. Sometimes, I imagine what I might say to them if I could address them all somehow. All the millions of clones who carried my work inside their bodies. What could I possibly say that would matter? I am sorry. Nay, but apology is inadequate. Apology implies that the harm was somehow accidental, unintended, a mistake that I regret. But I did this work deliberately, for decades, with full knowledge of what I was creating. Sorry doesn't begin to address that reality. I was wrong. But wrongness implies that I made an error in judgment that I could have avoided. The truth is more complex. You would do when I was designed to make these choices, bred and conditioned to view this work as acceptable. My wrongness was systemic, structural, the inevitable result of a society that treated life as a commodity to be engineered and deployed. You deserved better. But better than what? Better than being created as weapons? Better than being programmed for obedience? Better than living brief, violent lives? The only truly better option would have been not to exist at Allah, and I cannot know if that would have been better from your perspective. You lived. You experienced things. You formed bonds and developed identities and became people. Was that better than nothing, even if it came with suffering? I don't know. I don't have the right to know. I think perhaps that is the core of my guilt. Not just that I caused suffering, but that I arrogated to myself the right to make these decisions in the first place. To decide that life should be manufactured. To decide what form that life should take. To decide what purpose it should serve. To decide when it should end. We called it a God complex in our private moments. The cloners, the geneticists, the behavioral conditioning specialists. We would joke about it sometimes during the rare social gatherings we attended. Playing God, we called it. Creating life. Shaping it to our specifications. Determining its fate. But gods in the old myths were at least held accountable by other gods, by fate, by the moral frameworks of the stories they inhabited. We had no such accountability. We answered only to the Republic, then the Empire, and they cared only about production numbers and delivery schedules. No one asked us whether what we were doing was right. No one questioned the fundamental morality of manufacturing sentient beings for the purpose of warfare. Or perhaps they did question it, and we simply didn't listen. Perhaps there were protests, ethical objections, calls to stop the program. But if there were, they didn't reach me. Insulated as I was in my laboratories and gestation chambers, focused entirely on the technical challenges of my work, I was very good at not seeing the larger context, at treating each unit as an isolated technical problem, rather than a person embedded in a vast web of suffering, at measuring success through efficiency metrics rather than moral outcomes, at viewing my work as separate from its consequences. But there is no such separation. The consequences were always there. Every time I adjusted a hormone level or programmed a behavioral constraint or installed an inhibitor chip, I was shaping the life and death of a conscious being. Every decision I made rippled outward into experiences of pain or confusion or obedience or death. I knew this. Some part of me always knew this. That's why I needed the pharmaceutical assistance to sleep. That's why my hands trembled. That's why I would stand at my window for hours, watching the rain, trying to make sense of what I was doing. My attenuated emotional architecture was not completely successful at suppressing my awareness of what my work truly meant. But knowing was not enough to make me stop. I continued working, continued producing units, continued refining my techniques, because stopping would have meant confronting the full reality of what I had been doing, and I was not strong enough to do that. Not until it was too late. Not until the work was finished and there was nothing left but to look back at the vast field of destruction I had helped create. There is a recording I kept against regulations from one of the early conditioning sessions. A unit, barely 12 growth years old, being taught to disassemble and reassemble a blaster rifle, His hands moved clumsily at first, uncertain, and the conditioning instructor corrected him harshly. "You are a weapon," the instructor said. "Weapons do not hesitate. Weapons do not question. Repeat the procedure." The unit repeated it, faster this time, his hands finding the rhythm. But before moving to the next exercise, he paused and looked at the reassembled rifle in his hands. "Sir," he said, his voice uncertain, "what do we do when we're not fighting?" The instructor stared at him, clearly thrown by the question. "You are always fighting. That is your purpose. But when there are no enemies, when there's no war, there will always be war. You will always have enemies. Now continue the drill." The unit continued, and the session proceeded normally. But I kept that recording because of that question. What do we do when we're not fighting? It was a question that revealed the fundamental hollowness at the center of what we had created. We had designed them for a single purpose, but we had also given them the capacity to imagine existing beyond that purpose, to wonder about peace, about rest, about life after war. And we had given them that capacity because we needed them to be intelligent enough to be effective soldiers. But intelligence inevitably leads to questions that challenge the limitations we tried to impose. They were not supposed to ask what they would do when not fighting. They were supposed to fight and die, and never imagine any other possibility. But they asked anyway. They wondered anyway. They hoped for something more. Even though we had tried to eliminate that hope from their psychology. That unit died on Geonosis 3 cycles after that conditioning session. He never found out what he might do when not fighting. He never experienced peace. He lived exactly the life we had designed for him, brief, violent, purposeful only in service to others' objectives. But he asked a question. And that question is more human, more real, more valuable than anything I ever created in my laboratories. The other Kamino answer. Me colleagues, my supervisors, my subordinates, have largely accepted comfortable retirements. They do not speak about the work we did. It is finished, archived, a matter of historical record. They view it as I once viewed it, a technical achievement, a successful project, a challenging problem solved through expertise and dedication. I envy them that perspective, the ability to close that chapter and move forward without carrying the weight of what we did. But I cannot join them in that comfortable forgetting. The weight remains, getting heavier with each cycle, each moment of reflection, each new understanding of the magnitude of suffering I enabled. I am writing this account because it is the only thing I can do. I cannot undo what I did. I cannot resurrect the dead or unprogram the living. I cannot even help the survivors in any meaningful way. What aid could I possibly offer that wouldn't be tainted by the fact that I created the circumstances they're trying to escape? But I can bear witness. I can document what we did, how we did it, why we did it. I can refuse to let this atrocity be forgotten, or sanitized, or rationalized away. I can insist that every clone who lived and died was a person, not a product. That their suffering mattered. That what we did to them was wrong. This account will likely never be read by anyone. I have no means to distribute it, no audience that would care. The Empire would suppress it if they knew it existed. The surviving Kaminoans would consider it an embarrassing breach of professional discretion. And the clones themselves are. The ones who survived, who escaped, who built new lives in the shadows, they don't need my confession. They lived through what I merely enabled. But I'm writing it anyway. For the record, for the ghosts, for whatever accounting might someday be demanded of those who manufactured suffering on an industrial scale. I am 59 cycles old now. My body is beginning to show signs of age on nod. The accelerated deterioration we programmed into the clones, but the natural slowing that comes with time. My vision is less precise. My hands are less steady. My mind is less sharp than it once was. I am grateful for this decline. It means I will not live forever with this knowledge. Mew. There will be an end to this consciousness, this memory, this guilt. I will die, and the specific configuration of awareness that enabled me to do what I did will cease to exist. But the consequences of my work will persist. The survivors carry my programming inside their bodies, my conditioning inside their minds. The dead lie unburied across 1,000 worlds. The Empire continues using the tactics and technologies we developed, applying them to new populations, new methods of control. The system I served did not end with the clone program. It adapted, evolved, found new ways to manufacture compliance and deploy violence. The clones were merely one expression of a larger logica, the logic that treats life as a resource, that views individuals as components in vast machines, that measures success through efficiency rather than flourishing. I served that logic faithfully for 43 cycles. I embodied it, perfected it, became its most accomplished instrument. And now I understand that this, more than any specific act of cruelty, is the deepest evil. The transformation of people into functions, of lives into resources, of moral beings into tools. The clones resisted this transformation. They insisted on being people despite everything we did to prevent it. They formed bonds, developed identities, questioned their programming, chose compassion over compliance. They survived not because of what we made them, but because of what they made themselves. That is their victory, and it is complete. We tried to create perfect weapons, and instead, we created imperfect people who refused to remain weapons. We tried to manufacture obedience, and instead we provoked resistance. We tried to eliminate individuality, and instead, we ensured that every deviation from specification would be treasured as an assertion of selfhood. We failed. Our programming wasn't strong enough. Our conditioning wasn't permanent enough. Our control wasn't total enough. And that failure is the only source of hope in this entire catastrophia. That consciousness cannot be perfectly controlled. That personality cannot be perfectly suppressed. That humanity keeps emerging no matter how hard we try to eliminate it. But that hope does not absolve me. I still did what I did. I still enabled the suffering of millions. I still killed CT-6116 and CT-4519, and all the others whose only crime was displaying the humanity we tried so hard to prevent. The rain is falling outside my window. It has been falling for 59 cycles, precise and scheduled and meaningless. I watch it fall, and I think about designation codes. And I try to remember that each code was a person, and I fail to hold them all in my mind simultaneously because there were too many. Far too many. CT7, 567. CT4, 1401. CT8, 1831. CT6, 1116. CT4, 519. CT9, 909 surrender. CT5, 1100. On and on, millions of codes, millions of lives, millions of deaths. Each one unique, despite our efforts to make them identical. Each one valuable despite our insistence that they were expendable. Each one real despite our attempts to reduce them to abstractions. I made them. I programmed them. I conditioned them. I killed many of them directly. I enabled the killing of millions more. I am a monster. Not because I am cruel, but because I am complicit. Not because I am sadistic, but because I am systematic. Not because I enjoyed the suffering I caused, but because I caused it anyway, efficiently and professionally, and without allowing myself to fully see what I was doing until it was too late. This is my testimony, my confession, my attempt to ensure that what we did on Kamino is remembered not as a scientific triumph, but as a moral catastrophe, to insist that the clones were people, deserved to be treated as people, and were instead manufactured and deployed and discarded like equipment. To every clone who lived and died carrying my work inside their body, I am sorry. It is not enough. Nothing would be enough. But it is all I have left to offer. To every clone who survived, who escaped, who built a life beyond the purpose I designed them for, you succeeded despite me, not because of me. Your humanity was your achievement, not mine. I tried to eliminate it, and you preserved it anyway. That is the only victory in this entire tragedy. To anyone who might someday read this account, remember that the greatest atrocities are committed by people who think they are doing necessary work, who follow orders, who excel at their jobs, who never question the systems they serve, who measure success through efficiency rather than morality. I was bred to be that person. Optimized for it, perfected in it, but I still made choices. I could have refused. I could have questioned. I could have stopped. I didn't. No. And that is something I will carry until consciousness ceases, and this particular configuration of guilt and memory finally dissolves back into the elements we are all made from. The rain continues to fall outside my window. Race, time, mountain, scheduled, engineered. 1A. Perfect control. Perfect sterility. Perfect emptiness. I made millions of people to live and die in that rain, and I called it efficiency. I called it duty. I called it necessary. Doing? No. I was wrong. That is my testimony. That is my confession. That is all I have left to offer to the millions of lives I manufactured and destroyed. The rain falls. The designation codes scroll through my memory. And I stand here, watching, remembering, bearing witness to the magnitude of what we did, until the end.